Captain Robert Hayes yawned as he walked through the sliding doors of the airport at 5:30 a.m. The early morning sun hadn't even begun to peek over the horizon yet. He adjusted his pilot's cap and wheeled his small suitcase behind him, nodding at the security guards who recognized him from his years of service with Atlantic Airways. "Morning." "Captain Hayes," called out Tina from the coffee shop. "The usual today?" Robert smiled and nodded. "Thanks, Tina. I've got a long flight ahead." He took the steaming cup of black coffee, leaving his customary tip in the jar before continuing toward the staff area. 23 years as a pilot, and Robert still felt a flutter of excitement before each flight. He'd dreamed of flying since he was 8 years old, watching planes soar overhead from his grandmother's backyard. The journey hadn't been easy, working multiple jobs to pay for flight school, serving in the Air Force, and then slowly climbing the ranks at the airline. But every challenge had been worth it for the feeling of freedom he got when lifting a plane into the clouds. Robert checked his watch as he sipped his coffee. He was early as usual. He liked to arrive before the rest of the crew to review flight plans and weather reports one more time. Today's flight from Atlanta to San Francisco would be straightforward enough, though there was some turbulence predicted over the Rockies. As he approached the staff lounge, he noticed a few unfamiliar faces among the crew gathering for the pre-flight meeting. Atlantic Airways had been hiring lately, good news after the industry slowdown a few years back. "Good morning, everyone," Robert said as he entered the lounge, his deep voice carrying across the room. Most of the crew responded with warm greetings and smiles. They'd flown with him before and knew his reputation as one of the best pilots in the company, calm under pressure and always putting safety first. "Captain Hayes." "Good to see you again," said Michael, the head flight attendant who'd worked with Robert on dozens of flights. "We've got a couple of new crew members today." He gestured toward a woman standing near the window, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. "This is Diane Foster. She just transferred from Midwest Regional." Robert extended his hand with a friendly smile. "Welcome aboard, Diane. Looking forward to flying with you today." Diane hesitated for just a moment before taking his hand, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice cooler than the usual enthusiastic greeting he received from new crew members. Robert noticed the hesitation but didn't think much of it. First-day nerves affected everyone differently. He moved on to meet the other new crew member, a young man named Tyler, who seemed genuinely excited to be working with him. As the crew settled in for the briefing, Robert went through the standard procedures, discussing the flight path, expected weather conditions, and any passengers requiring special attention. He made eye contact with each crew member as he spoke, making sure everyone understood their responsibilities. "Any questions before we head to the aircraft?" he asked, glancing around the room. Diane raised her hand slightly. "Actually, I do have a question." Her tone had an edge to it that made the other crew members glance at each other. "I'm just curious about how many hours you've logged on the Boeing 787. The captain I usually fly with has over 5,000 hours specifically on this aircraft." The room fell quiet. The question itself wasn't unusual, but the way she asked it, with a hint of challenge in her voice, was surprising. Robert kept his expression neutral. "I've logged about 4,500 hours on the 787 specifically, and over 18,000 flight hours total across various aircraft types, including military jets." He said it matter-of-factly, without defensiveness. "Oh," Diane replied, looking somewhat surprised. "That's quite a lot. Is there something specific about the aircraft you're concerned about?" Robert asked calmly. "No, I just wanted to be sure we have experienced leadership." She glanced down at her notes. Michael jumped in quickly. "Captain Hayes is one of our most decorated pilots. He received the Airline Safety Award last year for his handling of that engine issue on the Chicago route." Diane nodded stiffly. "I see. Well, that's good to know." Robert moved the conversation forward, wrapping up the briefing professionally. As the crew gathered their things and prepared to head to the aircraft, he noticed Diane whispering to Tyler. The young man looked uncomfortable with whatever she was saying and quickly stepped away. During the pre-flight inspection, Robert walked around the massive 787 Dreamliner, checking every detail with the methodical precision that had become second nature over his career. The early morning chill caused his breath to fog as he examined the landing gear, engines, and control surfaces. First Officer Jennifer Powell joined him for part of the inspection, She'd flown with him many times before, and they worked together seamlessly. "Everything looks good," Jennifer said as they completed the exterior check, "though I'm not sure about our new flight attendant. Did you notice how she was acting in the briefing?" Robert nodded slightly. "I did. Could be first-day nerves." Jennifer frowned. "Maybe. But Michael told me she made some odd comments while you were checking in with dispatch. Asked how long you've been with the company, whether you were hired during that diversity initiative a few years back." Robert paused, his hand resting on the smooth metal of the aircraft. He'd heard comments like that before, the implication that he hadn't earned his position through merit and experience, but had been given it to fill some quota. After all these years, the sting hadn't fully gone away, but he'd learned not to let it show. "Well," he said after a moment, "let's give her the benefit of the doubt for now. People sometimes speak without thinking. The important thing is that we work together as a team to get everyone safely to San Francisco." Jennifer nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "Of course, Captain." As they boarded the aircraft, the ground crew was loading the last of the luggage. Robert greeted each crew member as they completed their pre-flight preparations. When he reached Diane, she was arranging safety equipment in the galley. "Everything in order here?" he asked politely. "Yes, Captain," she replied without looking up. "I've done this before." "I'm sure you have," he said evenly, "just checking in with everyone. It's part of my routine before every flight." She glanced up then, studying his face. "Your routine, right?" Robert continued his inspection, maintaining his professionalism despite the prickly encounter. As he made his way toward the cockpit, he overheard Diane talking with another flight attendant near the front galley. "Just surprising, that's all," she was saying in a low voice. "I mean, you have to wonder how he got the captain's seat so quickly. My brother's been trying for years and keeps getting passed over." "Diane, that's not fair," the other attendant whispered back urgently. "Captain Hayes has an incredible record. Everyone respects him." "I'm just saying what everyone thinks," Diane replied. "These diversity hires take positions away from people who've earned them the hard way. It's just statistics." Robert paused in the doorway, momentarily unseen. The familiar weight of those words settled on his shoulders. The constant suspicion that no matter how hard he worked, or how much he achieved, some people would always question his right to be there. He could have walked away and pretended not to hear. He could have reported her comments to management and had her removed from the flight. Instead, he stepped forward, making his presence known. "Excuse me," he said quietly. Both flight attendants turned, the color draining from Diane's face as she realized he had heard her. "Captain, she began. But Robert raised his hand slightly. "We're starting boarding in about 15 minutes, he said calmly. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment in the cockpit, Diane. Just a quick word before our passengers arrive." Her face was a mix of defensiveness and embarrassment as she nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." As they walked toward the cockpit, Robert felt the eyes of the other crew members following them. They had all sensed the tension building since the morning briefing. Now, with 154 passengers about to board, he had to decide exactly how to handle this situation, one that could either divide the crew or possibly become an opportunity for something unexpected. He took a deep breath as he opened the cockpit door. Whatever happened next would set the tone not just for this flight, but perhaps for something much more significant than either of them realized. The cockpit of the Boeing 787 was a marvel of modern technology, screens, and controls designed with the perfect balance of automation and manual operation. Robert gestured for Diane to enter ahead of him, then closed the door softly behind them. The gentle hum of the aircraft's systems provided a backdrop of white noise that somehow made the small space feel even more private. Diane stood stiffly near the jump seat, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. "I apologize if my comments were overheard, Captain," she said, though her tone suggested more embarrassment at being caught than genuine remorse. Robert didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he took a moment to look out through the massive windshield at the morning sky, now turning a pale blue as dawn broke over the airport. 23 years of flying, and he still found peace in that view. "Do you know why I became a pilot, Diane?" he asked quietly. The question clearly wasn't what she expected. No, sir," Robert turned to face her. "When I was 8 years old, my uncle took me to an air show. I watched the planes dance across the sky, and I knew right then what I wanted to do with my life." He smiled at the memory. I told my grandmother that evening that I was going to be a pilot. She didn't tell me it was impossible. She just said I'd have to work twice as hard as everyone else. Diane shifted uncomfortably but didn't interrupt. And she was right, Robert continued. I worked 3 jobs to pay for flight school. Spent 6 years in the Air Force. Started at this airline washing planes and doing maintenance before they ever let me in a cockpit. He paused. Not because I wasn't qualified, but because some people took one look at me and decided I couldn't possibly know what I was doing. Captain, I didn't mean... Please. Robert held up his hand. Let me finish. Then you can speak freely. His voice remained calm, not accusatory. I've spent my entire career proving myself over and over again. Extra simulator hours. Perfect attendance. Taking the routes nobody wanted. I've had passengers ask to be moved when they saw me board the plane. I've had crew members question my every decision. He looked directly at her now. So when you suggest that I'm a diversity hire, who took someone else's rightful place, you're not saying anything I haven't heard before. Diane's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. With all due respect, sir, the airline does have quotas they need to meet. That's just a fact. My brother has perfect scores and 10 years of experience, but he's been passed over 3 times now. And you've decided that's because of people like me? The numbers speak for themselves, she said, her voice gaining confidence. It's not personal, it's very personal to me, Robert said, his voice still measured but firm. Every time someone looks at my skin instead of my record, it's personal. But this isn't just about me being offended, Diane. This is about our crew and our passengers. First Officer Jennifer knocked briefly before opening the door. Captain, boarding will start in 5 minutes. Thank you, Jennifer, Robert nodded. She gave them both a concerned look before closing the door again. Robert sighed and finally sat down in the captain's chair, gesturing for Diane to take the jump seat. Here's my dilemma. We have a 6-hour flight ahead of us. I need every member of this crew working together seamlessly. I can't have tension or distrust in my cabin crew. Diane's expression tightened. Are you removing me from the flight? Robert studied her for a moment. I'd be within my rights as captain. We'd delay the flight, fill out reports, you'd probably face disciplinary action. He shook his head. But I don't think that solves anything, does it? Confusion flickered across Diane's face. Then what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we try something different, Robert said. I'm suggesting we use this flight to learn from each other. Diane's eyebrows rose in surprise. I don't understand. I'd like you to spend some time in this cockpit today. Not just the standard crew visits, but really see what we do up here. And I'd like to hear about your brother. About his experiences trying to become a pilot. I want to understand your perspective better. Why would you do that? After what I said? Robert smiled slightly. Because the easiest thing in the world is to dismiss someone who disagrees with you. The harder thing, the thing that actually makes a difference, is to try to understand them. A knock at the door interrupted them. Michael, the head flight attendant, poked his head in. Everything okay in here? Passengers are starting to board. We're good, Michael, Robert assured him. Ms. Foster and I were just finishing our conversation. She'll be out in a moment to help with boarding. Michael nodded and closed the door, though his concerned expression lingered. Diane stood up, smoothing her uniform. I should get to my station. She hesitated. For what it's worth, Captain, I shouldn't have made assumptions about your qualifications. It's a start, Robert acknowledged. We'll talk more during the flight. As Diane left the cockpit, Robert took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if his approach would make any difference, but he'd learned long ago that responding to prejudice with anger rarely changed minds. Sometimes the most powerful response was unexpected kindness. Jennifer returned to the cockpit and settled into the first officer's seat. Everything okay with Foster? We'll see, Robert replied, beginning his pre-flight checks. Let's focus on getting these people to San Francisco safely. That's the job. Jennifer nodded, respecting his decision even if she didn't fully understand it. Together they ran through the checklist with practiced efficiency as the last passengers boarded the plane. Outside the cockpit, the atmosphere among the cabin crew was tense. Word had spread quickly about Diane's comments and the captain's unusual response. Michael pulled Diane aside as she helped a passenger stow a bag in the overhead compartment. What happened in there? He whispered. The captain didn't report you? Diane shook her head, looking somewhat bewildered. No, he wants to talk more during the flight. Said he wants to understand my perspective better. Michael raised an eyebrow. That's Captain Hayes for you. Never does what you expect. He fixed her with a serious look. He's the best pilot I've ever flown with, Diane. Not because of or despite anything about him, just because he is. Give him a chance before you judge. Before she could respond, the final boarding call came through. The flight attendants moved efficiently to their positions, completing their preparations as the boarding door closed. Robert's voice came over the intercom, warm and confident as he welcomed the passengers aboard Flight 1157 to San Francisco. From her position near the front of the plane, Diane watched the passengers settle in, many of them visibly relaxing at the sound of the captain's steady voice. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Diane found herself thinking about the conversation in the cockpit. The captain's response had caught her completely off guard. She'd been prepared for anger, for a reprimand, maybe even for being removed from the flight. His calm invitation to understand each other better was the last thing she'd expected. The massive engines roared to life, and the plane began its taxi toward the runway. Through the cabin windows, the morning sun cast a golden glow across the airport. Diane completed her safety checks automatically, her mind still processing the unexpected turn of events. When the plane lifted smoothly off the runway, climbing steadily into the clear blue sky, Diane felt the familiar sensation of leaving the ground behind. But today, something else had been left behind too. Her certainty that she understood exactly how the world worked. 2 hours into the flight, with the service completed and passengers settled, Michael approached Diane in the galley. "Captain's asking for you in the cockpit," he said, his expression neutral. "I'll cover your section." Diane nodded, suddenly nervous as she made her way forward. She knocked on the cockpit door and waited for it to open. Robert turned in his seat as she entered, giving her a brief nod. "Perfect timing, Ms. Foster. I've just switched to autopilot for a while. First Officer Powell is taking her break." Diane stood awkwardly just inside the door. "You wanted to see me, Captain? Please have a seat." He gestured to the empty first officer's chair. "And call me Robert when we're not making announcements." Hesitantly, Diane sat down, trying not to touch any of the controls. The view from the cockpit was breathtaking. Endless blue sky above and below, the patchwork landscape of America passing by at 550 miles per hour. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Robert said, noticing her gaze. "Yes," she admitted. "I've never actually sat up here during flight before. First time for everything," he smiled. "Now, you mentioned your brother has been trying to become a pilot. Tell me about him." Diane looked surprised at the direct question but began to talk about her brother Thomas, his childhood dream of flying, his struggles to afford flight school, the loans he was still paying off, and his frustration at not advancing as quickly as he'd hoped. Robert listened attentively, asking occasional questions. The conversation flowed more easily than either of them might have expected. Outside, the plane continued its journey westward, carrying them all toward California, and toward an understanding that would reshape more than just this single flight. As Diane finished talking about her brother, Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to tell you something about my journey to this seat," he said, his hand resting lightly on the control yoke. "And then I have a proposal that might surprise you." Robert adjusted his position in the captain's seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him. Outside the cockpit windows, fluffy clouds drifted by as the plane cruised at 37,000 feet. The hum of the engines provided a constant, comforting background noise that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. "I grew up in Cleveland," he began, his eyes on the horizon. "My dad fixed cars and my mom taught elementary school. We didn't have much, but they made sure I had books and opportunities." He smiled at the memory. "That air show I mentioned, my uncle saved for months to take me there. He knew how much I wanted to see those planes up close." Diane listened quietly, her earlier defensiveness softening slightly. "When I told my teachers I wanted to be a pilot, most of them suggested more realistic goals," Robert continued. "One actually laughed. But there was this one science teacher, Mr. Patterson, who slipped me books about aviation and physics. He'd stay after school to help me understand the principles of flight." He paused to check an instrument, making a small adjustment before continuing. "I worked through high school at a grocery store, saving every penny. Applied for every scholarship I could find. Still wasn't enough for flight school, so I joined the Air Force. Figured that was my best shot." Diane shifted in her seat. "My brother tried that route too. Didn't get accepted into the program." Robert nodded. "It's incredibly competitive. I almost didn't make it myself." Failed the first time, actually. You did? Diane looked surprised. Vision test? Robert said with a slight grin. Studied so hard I wasn't sleeping. Eyes were bloodshot during the exam. They thought I had a problem with my eyesight. Had to wait 6 months to reapply and prove my vision was perfect. The radio crackled with a message from air traffic control. Robert responded with practiced ease, adjusting their course slightly before returning to the conversation. The Air Force was tough, but fair. I flew transport planes mostly. C-17s. Not the fighter jets I'd dreamed about as a kid, but I was in the air, and that's what mattered. His expression grew more serious. There were incidents, of course, comments, questions about whether I belonged there, but I just kept my head down and focused on being the best pilot I could be. My brother says the same thing, Diane admitted. People assume he got where he is because of connections or something, not because of his skills. It goes both ways, Robert said. I've had people assume I couldn't possibly be qualified enough to be in this seat. They don't see the thousands of hours of training, the sleepless nights studying regulations, the sacrifices. He glanced at her. Just like your brother, I've had to prove myself over and over. There was a knock on the cockpit door. Jennifer had returned from her break. I should get back to the cabin, Diane said, rising from the seat. Actually, Robert said, if you're interested, I'd like you to stay a bit longer. Jennifer can cover the forward cabin for now. I want to show you something. Jennifer raised an eyebrow but nodded. No problem, Captain. We're all good back there anyway. Most passengers are watching movies or napping. As Jennifer settled back into the first officer's seat, Robert turned to Diane. Have you ever wondered exactly what we do up here once we're cruising? Diane shrugged. I figured the computer does most of the work at this point. Robert and Jennifer exchanged amused glances. That's what most people think, Jennifer said. But there's a lot more to it. For the next 30 minutes, Robert and Jennifer walked Diane through their ongoing responsibilities, monitoring weather patterns ahead, calculating fuel usage, communicating with air traffic control, planning for potential diversions, and constantly checking the aircraft's systems. We're always thinking 3 steps ahead, Robert explained. Right now we're watching a weather system developing near Reno that might affect our approach into San Francisco. We're already planning an alternate route if needed. Diane watched with growing interest as they demonstrated the complex choreography of piloting a commercial aircraft. The technical skill and constant vigilance required was far more involved than she'd imagined. I had no idea, she admitted. From the cabin, it seems like once we're in the air, you just cruise. Common misconception, Jennifer said with a smile. People think autopilot means we're just sitting here doing crossword puzzles. Speaking of which, Robert said, checking the time, we should start planning our descent soon. Jennifer, could you run through the preliminary checklist? As Jennifer began the process, Robert turned back to Diane. Before you go, I wanted to make that proposal I mentioned. I'm listening, Diane said, curiosity evident in her voice. Your brother, Thomas, right? You said he's trying to advance but keeps getting passed over. If he's as qualified as you say, I'd like to help. Diane's eyes widened. Help? How? I'm on the mentorship committee at the airline. We work with promising pilots who need additional support or guidance. If Thomas is interested, I could review his file, maybe give him some coaching on the interview process. Why would you do that? Diane asked, genuine confusion in her voice. After what I said about you? Robert held her gaze steadily. Because this isn't just about you and me. It's about making sure the best pilots get the opportunities they deserve, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. He paused. And because 20 years ago someone did the same for me when they had every reason not to. Before Diane could respond, the flight intercom buzzed. Michael's voice came through. Captain, we've got a situation in the main cabin. Nothing serious, but could use some guidance. I'll be right there, Diane said automatically, then looked at Robert. Unless you need me to stay? Go ahead, Robert said. We can continue this conversation later. We've still got about 3 hours of flight time left. As Diane left the cockpit, her mind was reeling. The man she had so quickly judged and dismissed was now offering to help her brother. It didn't fit with the narrative she'd constructed in her head, and that uncomfortable fact forced her to confront her own assumptions. Back in the main cabin, the situation turned out to be a minor dispute between passengers over a reclined seat. Diane handled it smoothly, finding a compromise that satisfied everyone involved. As she moved through the cabin afterward, checking on other passengers. She found herself thinking about the contrast between what she'd expected of Captain Hayes and what she'd actually experienced. During a quiet moment in the galley, Michael approached her. "So how was your time in the captain's chair?" His tone was light, but his eyes were searching. "Educational," Diane admitted. "They do a lot more up there than I realized." Michael nodded. "Captain Hayes is one of the best. Ask anyone who's flown with him." He lowered his voice. "You know, a few years back we had an engine warning light come on over the Pacific. Middle of the night, bad weather, hundreds of miles from the nearest airport. Most pilots would have panicked at least a little." "What did Hayes do?" Diane asked. "He was so calm you'd think we were just out for a Sunday drive. Ran through every possible scenario, communicated with maintenance on the ground, made the decision to continue to our destination, but with modified power settings." Michael shook his head in admiration. "Turned out to be a sensor malfunction, but the way he handled it, that's when I knew I'd fly with him anywhere." Diane absorbed this information silently. It was yet another piece that didn't fit with her preconceptions. "We all have our stories about him," Michael continued. "Ask anyone on this crew." And over the next hour, as the flight continued its journey westward, Diane did just that. During quiet moments, she spoke with each crew member, hearing stories about Robert that painted a picture very different from the one she had assumed, from the flight attendant who'd been with the airline for 30 years. "When my husband was sick with cancer, Robert adjusted his own schedule to cover for me so I could be at the hospital. Never made a big deal about it, from a younger flight attendant on only his third flight. I was so nervous on my first day, kept messing up the announcements. The captain, Hayes, spent his break helping me practice, gave me tips on how to stay calm. From the cabin service director, there was this really bad turbulence on a flight last year. Passengers were panicking. Hayes got on the intercom and explained exactly what was happening in this really reassuring way. Had everyone calming down within minutes." Each story chipped away at Diane's certainty, forcing her to reconsider judgments she'd made too quickly and too confidently. 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed over the Rocky Mountains, Diane was restocking supplies in the forward galley when Robert emerged from the cockpit. "Taking a quick break," he explained, stretching his back. "Thought I'd check how things are going back here." "All good, Captain," Diane said, then hesitated. "Actually, I've been meaning to ask you something." "Go ahead," Robert said, pouring himself a cup of water. "The other crew members, they all have these stories about you. Things you've done to help them. Ways you've gone above and beyond." She met his eyes directly. "Why, I mean, it's not in your job description to be, well, kind." Robert considered this for a moment. "My grandmother used to say something that stuck with me all these years. The true measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them. It's how they treat those who can't." He shrugged slightly. "Besides, we spend more time with our crew than with our families some weeks. Makes sense to look out for each other." Diane nodded slowly, processing his words. The intercom buzzed before she could respond. "Captain, we're approaching that weather system," Jennifer's voice came through. "Might want to take a look." "Be right there," Robert replied. He turned back to Diane. "Duty calls. But think about what I said about your brother." "My offer stands." As he walked back to the cockpit, Diane found herself watching him with new eyes. The realization that she had been completely wrong about him was uncomfortable, but unavoidable. And as the plane began its initial descent toward San Francisco, something else was descending too. The walls of prejudice she had built so carefully around her perceptions. The weather system near Reno turned out to be more significant than initially predicted. Dark clouds loomed ahead as the plane began its descent toward San Francisco, the earlier clear blue skies giving way to ominous gray. In the cockpit, Robert and Jennifer studied the radar display with practiced eyes. "Looks like we'll need to adjust our approach," Robert said calmly, making a slight course correction. "Let's request a different vector from ATC." Jennifer nodded and contacted air traffic control while Robert addressed the cabin crew through the intercom. "Crew, this is the captain speaking. We're expecting some turbulence during our descent. Please secure the cabin and take your seats a bit earlier than usual." In the main cabin, Diane and the other flight attendants moved efficiently through their pre-landing routine, collecting trash, securing loose items, and ensuring passengers were prepared for landing. The plane jolted suddenly, causing a few passengers to gasp. "Just a little bumpy air," Diane reassured an anxious-looking woman clutching her armrest. Captain Hayes is very experienced with these conditions. Nothing to worry about. She realized with a start that she actually believed what she was saying. The confidence in her voice wasn't forced. Somehow, over the course of this flight, her perception of the pilot had completely transformed. The intercom chimed again. "Cabin crew, this is the captain. Please take your seats now. We're going to be dealing with some moderate chop for the next 10 minutes or so." As Diane secured herself in the jump seat at the front of the cabin, the plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Outside the windows, rain began to lash against the glass as they entered the storm clouds. A few passengers looked around nervously, while others clutched their armrests or closed their eyes. The plane dropped suddenly, eliciting cries from several passengers. Diane felt her stomach lurch with the unexpected movement. This was more than the moderate chop the captain had predicted. She exchanged glances with Michael, seated across from her. "Bigger storm than they thought," he mouthed. The intercom came to life again, but this time it was Robert's voice addressing the passengers directly. His tone was conversational and calm, as if he were chatting with friends over coffee rather than piloting a plane through turbulence. "Folks, this is Captain Hayes speaking. I know we're experiencing some bumps right now. Nothing to be concerned about, just a weather system we're passing through on our way to San Francisco. Think of it like driving down a dirt road rather than a smooth highway. The plane is designed to handle conditions much more challenging than this." The plane dipped and rocked again, but somehow the captain's steady voice made it seem less frightening. "We're working with air traffic control to find a smoother route down, but it might be a bit bumpy for the next few minutes. I've turned on the seatbelt sign, so please remain in your seats. We're still on schedule to land in about 25 minutes. As the captain continued to speak, explaining in simple terms what was happening and why, Diane watched the effect on the passengers. Nervous expressions began to relax. A child who had been crying quieted down. The tension in the cabin noticeably decreased, all because of the confident, reassuring voice coming through the speakers. It was a masterclass in leadership, taking a situation that could have escalated into panic and transforming it with nothing more than calm words and transparent communication. Diane found herself impressed yet again. The turbulence continued for another 15 minutes as they descended through the storm clouds. Through it all, Robert provided occasional updates, his voice a steady anchor amid the bumpy ride. When they finally broke through the cloud cover, the San Francisco Bay spread out below them, gray under the overcast sky but still a welcome sight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've passed through the worst of it," Robert announced. "If you look out the left side of the aircraft, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. Local time in San Francisco is 11:42 a.m., and the temperature is a cool 58 degrees with light rain. We'll be on the ground in about 10 minutes. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The landing, when it came, was remarkably smooth given the conditions. A gentle touchdown that barely registered, followed by the familiar sensation of deceleration as the plane taxied toward the terminal. As passengers prepared to disembark, many made a point of thanking the crew, several specifically mentioning the captain's calming presence during the turbulence. Diane found herself feeling a strange sense of pride in these comments, as if she were somehow associated with Robert's skill and composure. After the last passenger had left, the crew began their post-flight duties. Diane was checking the overhead bins when Robert emerged from the cockpit, flight bag in hand. "Nice work today, everyone," he said to the assembled crew. "That was some unexpected weather at the end there. Appreciate you keeping everything under control in the cabin." The crew dispersed to complete their tasks, but Robert lingered for a moment. "Ms. Foster, a word before you go?" Diane followed him to the front galley away from the others. Robert seemed to be considering his words carefully. "I meant what I said earlier about your brother," he finally said. "If he's interested in some mentoring, have him email me." He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "My personal email is on there. Tell him to mention you in the subject line so I don't miss it." Diane took the card slowly, turning it over in her fingers. "I don't understand why you're being so nice after how I acted." Robert leaned against the bulkhead, fatigue from the challenging landing finally showing on his face. "When I was a new first officer, I had a captain who didn't think I belonged in the cockpit. Made my life miserable for 6 months straight." He shook his head at the memory. "I promised myself I'd never become that person no matter what. I judged you before I knew anything about you," Diane admitted. The words difficult but necessary. I was wrong. We all make assumptions, Robert said with a slight shrug. The question is what we do when those assumptions are challenged. He checked his watch. I've got a quick turnaround. Heading back to Atlanta in 3 hours. But I meant what I said. Have your brother reach out? Diane nodded. I will, and thank you. As Robert walked away, Diane stood there holding his business card, thinking about how differently this day had turned out from what she'd expected. She'd boarded this flight full of certainty about the way the world worked. Who belonged where, who deserved what. Now those certainties had been shaken to their core. 3 days later, Diane sat in her apartment staring at her phone. On the screen was a text from her brother Thomas. Just got off a video call with Captain Hayes. You won't believe what happened. She smiled, remembering the surprising conversation she'd had with Thomas the day after the flight. How reluctant he'd been at first when she'd suggested reaching out to Robert. Why would some captain you just met want to help me? He'd asked suspiciously. Diane had hesitated, embarrassed to admit the truth, but knowing it was necessary. Because I was awful to him, Thomas. I made the same assumptions about him that people make about you, and instead of getting angry, he offered to help. There had been a long silence on the phone. That's not what I expected, Thomas had finally said. Me neither, Diane had admitted. That's kind of the point. Now, 3 days later, she hit the call button instead of responding to the text. Thomas answered immediately. So? She asked. How did it go? Diane, this guy is incredible, Thomas said, excitement evident in his voice. We talked for almost an hour. He reviewed my application materials, gave me specific feedback on what the interview panels are looking for, offered to connect me with the chief pilot at the Atlanta hub. He paused, and he didn't sugarcoat anything. Told me exactly where I need more experience, what courses would help me stand out. That sounds like him, Diane said, smiling despite herself. But here's the crazy part, Thomas continued. He told me about this pilot mentorship program he runs. Said they're looking for candidates exactly like me. Experienced pilots who just need that final push to make captain. He's nominating me for the spring cohort. Diane felt a surge of emotion. Happiness for her brother mixed with lingering shame about her own behavior. That's amazing, Thomas. I think this could really happen for you. All because you were rude to some random pilot, Thomas laughed. Maybe you should be rude to people more often. Don't even joke about that, Diane said seriously. I nearly ruined a good man's day because I couldn't see past my own assumptions. I got lucky that he was big enough to look past it. There was a brief silence as Thomas absorbed her words. You know, he said finally, Hayes told me something interesting. Said he used to be angry all the time about how people treated him. Said it nearly ruined his career because he was always waiting for the next insult, the next person to question whether he belonged. What changed? Diane asked. He said he realized that changing minds one at a time was the only way forward. That getting angry might feel good in the moment, but it never actually fixed anything. Thomas paused. He said sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't outrage, it's excellence and kindness. People can argue with your words, but they can't argue with your actions. Diane thought about the steady way Robert had guided the plane through turbulence, the respect he commanded from his crew, the generosity he'd shown to someone who had dismissed him. He lives that, doesn't he? Seems like it, Thomas agreed. Makes me think about how I've been handling my own frustrations. Maybe there's a better way. After hanging up with her brother, Diane sat quietly for a long time, thinking about the unexpected chain of events set in motion by that early morning flight. She'd boarded the plane certain that she understood how the world worked and her place in it. She'd left with those certainties thoroughly shaken. Next week she'd be flying again, different route, different crew. But she'd be boarding that plane as a slightly different person, someone who might pause before making assumptions, someone who might look for the full story before passing judgment. It wasn't a complete transformation. Those rarely happen in real life. But it was a beginning, and as Captain Hayes had demonstrated so clearly, sometimes a beginning was all you needed to change course. 6 months later, Diane walked through Terminal B at Atlanta International Airport, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She checked her watch, still 30 minutes before crew briefing for her flight to Chicago. She'd transferred to the Atlanta base 3 months ago, partly to be closer to her brother Thomas, but also because she'd heard the mentorship program there was making waves throughout the airline industry. She hadn't seen Captain Hayes since that fateful flight to San Francisco, though Thomas had kept her updated on their regular meetings. As she passed the airport coffee shop, a familiar voice called out to her, "Ms. Foster? Is that you?" She turned to see Robert Hayes sitting at a small table, a cup of coffee and an open laptop in front of him. He looked much as she remembered, calm, professional, with kind eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. "Captain Hayes?" she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "What a surprise. Please join me if you have time," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "And it's just Robert when we're not on duty." Diane hesitated only briefly before sitting down. "I have about 20 minutes before briefing." "Perfect timing then," Robert said, closing his laptop. "I was just reviewing some training materials. How have you been?" "Thomas mentioned you'd transferred to Atlanta." "I've been good," Diane said. "Really good, actually. The crews here are great," Robert nodded. "Atlanta's always been my favorite base. Good mix of international and domestic roots, solid team atmosphere." He took a sip of his coffee. "Thomas tells me you've been helping him prepare for his final captain assessment." Diane smiled. "Trying to, anyway. He's the one doing all the hard work." "He's impressive," Robert said. "One of the most dedicated pilots in the program. His simulator scores last month were outstanding." A comfortable silence fell between them, so different from the tense atmosphere of their first meeting 6 months ago. Diane found herself marveling at how much had changed, not just in her circumstances but in her perspective. "I never properly thanked you," she said finally. "Not just for helping Thomas, but for how you handled things. That day on the flight?" She met his eyes directly. "You could have reported me, had me removed from the crew. No one would have blamed you." Robert considered her words. "You know, I almost did," he admitted. "When I first heard your comments, my first instinct was anger. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to file that report. Why didn't you?" He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "Years ago, I had a mentor, Captain Wilson. Tough as nails, brilliant pilot. He told me something I've never forgotten. Said that in this job, we're not just responsible for the aircraft, but for the people. And sometimes that means looking beyond the immediate situation to see the bigger picture." He stirred his coffee absently. "Reporting you might have felt satisfying in the moment. Might have protected my pride. But what would it have actually accomplished? You'd have been disciplined, maybe even lost your job. You'd have been angry, resentful, and nothing would have really changed." Diane nodded slowly. "Instead, you changed how I think. Not just about you, but about a lot of things. That's the hope," Robert smiled. "Though you did most of the hard work yourself, being willing to reconsider deeply held beliefs, that takes courage." A voice came over the PA system announcing a gate change for an upcoming flight. The noise of the busy airport continued around them. Passengers hurrying to gates, children laughing, the hum of conversations in a dozen languages. "There's something I've been wondering," Diane said after the announcement ended. "That day when I made those comments, how many times have you had to deal with something like that in your career?" Robert's expression turned thoughtful. "Too many to count," he said honestly. "Some more direct than others. Some worse. How do you not get, I don't know, bitter about it? Angry all the time?" "Who says I don't?" Robert laughed softly. "I have my moments, believe me. But I learned a long time ago that carrying that anger around was only hurting me, not changing anything." He paused. "There's a quote I keep on my desk at home. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." "Martin Luther King," Diane said. Robert nodded, looking slightly surprised. "I've been doing some reading these past few months," she explained. "Trying to understand a lot of things." "That's more than most people ever do," Robert said. He glanced at his watch. "You should probably head to your briefing. Which flight are you on today?" "Chicago, then connecting to Boston," Diane said, gathering her things. "Back tomorrow evening," Robert nodded. "Actually, before you go, there's something I wanted to mention. The airline is expanding its crew diversity initiative. They're looking for flight attendants to serve as liaisons to work with the pilot mentorship program, share perspectives across departments." He pulled a brochure from his laptop bag. "The application deadline is next week. I think you'd have a lot to offer." Diane took the brochure, surprised. "You think I should apply? After how we met?" Especially because of how we met, Robert said seriously. Your perspective is valuable, Diane. You've experienced a shift in thinking that a lot of people never get to have. That's a powerful story to share. As Diane walked toward her gate, the brochure tucked safely in her bag, she thought about how different her life looked from what she had imagined 6 months ago. Her brother was on track to become a captain. She had transferred to a new base, and now potentially, a new role that could help shape the airline's culture. All because one person had chosen to respond to prejudice not with anger, but with understanding. 2 weeks later, Diane sat in a conference room at the airline's headquarters, surrounded by 15 other crew members selected for the new Diversity Liaison program. At the front of the room stood Robert, along with the airline's Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Training. Welcome, everyone, the Chief Diversity Officer began. You've been selected for this program because each of you brings a unique perspective to our team. Over the next 6 months, you'll be helping us reshape how our crews work together, how we mentor new talent, and how we address the unconscious biases that affect all of us. As the presentation continued, Diane found herself studying the faces around her, men and women of different ages, races, and backgrounds, each with their own stories, their own journeys to this room. During the coffee break, Robert approached her. Congratulations on being selected, he said. The committee was impressed with your application, particularly your essay about challenging assumptions. Diane smiled. I had good material to work with. I wanted to share some news, Robert said. Thomas passed his final captain assessment yesterday. He'll be getting his 4th stripe next month. He called me last night, actually, Diane said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. He was so excited he could barely form sentences. Said he couldn't have done it without you. Robert shook his head. He did the work. I just pointed him in the right direction. He glanced around the room at the other program participants. That's what all of this is about, really. Opening doors that should have been open all along. At the end of the day, as the group prepared to leave, the head of training asked if anyone would like to share their thoughts about why they had applied for the program. After a moment of silence, Diane found herself raising her hand. Standing before her colleagues, she took a deep breath. 6 months ago, I boarded a flight with certain assumptions about the world and my place in it. I had ideas about who belonged where, who deserved what. I judged someone based entirely on how they looked, not who they were or what they had accomplished. The room was quiet now, everyone focused on her words. That person could have responded with anger, could have reported me, had me disciplined. Instead, they chose to see past my behavior to the person I could become. She glanced at Robert, who gave her a slight nod of encouragement. I'm here because I learned that day that change is possible, that assumptions can be challenged, that we can be better tomorrow than we are today. And if I can learn that lesson, anyone can. As she returned to her seat amid appreciative nods and murmurs, Diane caught Robert's eye across the room. He gave her a small smile that spoke volumes. Pride, respect, and the shared understanding of two people who had journeyed from conflict to cooperation. Outside the windows of the conference room, planes took off and landed on the distant runways, carrying thousands of people to destinations across the globe.